Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast on your favorite podcast app.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from Spyscape Studios.
It was like being in Casablanca when they crank up the engines and the smoke's rolling out of them, and I see her face in the window and I'm waving at her, and I don't know if I'm going to see her again.
Special Forces, Kinshasa. It's 1992. Zaire, which is now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, is in the hands of an authoritarian kleptocrat called Mobutu Sese Seko, a man who claims to take great pride in his country's national authenticity. More than that, however, he prizes his own fortune and his own power.
One of Mobutu's favorite things was basically to play one military unit off against another. Quite often the units were made up of one tribal group or another. He had his own presidential guard, which was very close to him, and they were the elite, of course. They were better paid, better equipped. But there was another unit that was the paratroops, and they had a battalion paratroops also within the capital in Kinshasa.
At the start of the decade, however, both of these groups were suffering at the hands of Mobutu. Zaire's president was no longer paying his troops. And to make matters worse, the country's economy was tanking.
In 1991, the country was pretty much already in a financial freefall, and he could not afford to pay these units for real. And one of the units, the paratroops, mutinied against the government, and that created what was called the events, les événements.
The 3,000 paratroopers that rebelled against Mobutu's government began looting the city and forced the country's primary international airport to close. Soon they were joined by civilians demanding an end to Mobutu's repressive dictatorship, which by then had bled into its 26th year.
The actual really devastating part of it probably lasted for about 2 weeks, but after that it was extremely tense. And there were troops roaming the streets, so you've had different areas controlled by different sets of troops. And at the same time, the criminal elements were out. It was extremely restive and extremely dangerous.
This was the scene into which US Army Green Beret James Stejskal found himself injected in the spring of 1992. One that was tense, unstable, and unsafe. Not that that dampened James's sense of humor.
I think I was the right guy for the job because I was the only one available that weekend, but I'm not sure.
Sometimes, life in the Special Forces is perilous and full of action. Other times, it's laced with optimism and marked by celebratory pints of beer. What you're about to hear is a snapshot of one such Special Forces operation. A 7-month stint in 1990s Zaire that cannot be classified by any one genre. It's the story of a hair-raising era in Zaire's history, after the end of the Cold War, when simply moving from place to place within the country imperiled our hero, and when danger lurked on every street and in every pub. And as much as it's a thriller, it's also a love story. Most of all, it's an insight into life on the ground in a time and a place that most Western listeners won't be familiar with. So sit back and enjoy the ride. If you remember James from episode 9 of True Spies, Shadow Games, you'll remember he had already taken part in an elite mission in 1970s Berlin. Which is to say, despite his modest recollection of events, James did have a few qualifications to his name.
I was in a special forces unit, and we were all trained in these weird esoteric skills that are necessary to be a special forces or a special operations guy. You have to have a knowledge of communications, you have to have a knowledge of how to work around airplanes, set up landing zones, how to use boats, all the kind of Boy Scout skills that you need for an evacuation like this. Like I said, I was one of the available ones, and I think I stuck up my hand mistakenly and was selected.
But let's back up a bit. Because it wasn't just Zaire, as the country was then known, that was in the midst of serious turmoil. When James was assigned to work in Central Africa, he knew he was walking into a morass of complex political and historical forces.
Parts of Africa were very much at the heart of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, even to some degree the People's Republic of China, primarily because of the resources that were found there. Oil in Angola, of course, that was a big one, but one of the things that drew the United States into Zaire was uranium. The uranium for the atomic bombs came from Zaire, a mine called Stejskal, and that was always a resource that the United States was trying to get a corner on.
Belgium had occupied the region since the late 19th century. But in the late 1950s, revolutionary changes sweeping across the continent began to turn the tide for the Belgian Congo too. Ghana achieved its independence from the United Kingdom in 1957, inspiring other African nations to break free from colonial rule. In 1960, the Republic of Congo, with its capital in Kinshasa, was born. But that new chapter came with new challenges.
There was basically a fight to see who would be in charge of the country as the new president. One of the big problems at the time was a man by the name of Patrice Lumumba, who the Americans and the Belgians both worried was a communist. So I think you remember pretty much how paranoid the Western governments were about communists in Africa.
The Americans worried that the Soviets, keen to get their hands on Africa's valuable natural resources, would manipulate influential African leaders to their advantage. One such leader was an independence activist who became the first Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo. That was Patrice Lumumba. But in the immediate aftermath of the country's receiving independence, Congo was plunged into chaos, and Lumumba looked to the Soviet Union for support, with devastating consequences. The decision to seek support from the Soviet Union would ultimately be Lumumba's undoing, because in the eyes of Western powers, it made him someone who posed an international threat.
Long story made short, we supported another man by the name of Mobutu, who essentially eliminated Lumumba, and then he became the president for life, essentially, of Zaire.
I'll make this story a little longer. Lumumba had, in fact, sought out help from the United States and also the United Nations. Only after he was denied support from the West did he turn to the Soviet Union. And the West took note. CIA records now make clear that US President Dwight Eisenhower authorized the assassination of Lumumba and initially plotted to poison him. But the record shows that, ultimately, Lumumba met his end at the hands of his fellow Congolese. On the 17th of January 1961, a group of Belgian-backed separatists captured Lumumba, tortured him, put him up against a wall, and shot him. His remains were desecrated, ostensibly to prevent the formation of a burial site, where the former Prime Minister could be mourned. In other words, as a way to erase his legacy. Lumumba's death cleared a path for Mobutu to establish an autocratic government in Congo, or, as it was known starting in 1971,
Zaire, or Congo, became Zaire under Mobutu. He changed the name back to sort of more indigenous name, he thought. And that country was one of the keystones for American foreign policy in Africa.
The truth about America's interest in eliminating Lumumba has emerged slowly in the years since it took place. You can hear about how some of these revelations came to light in the True Spies episode, The Last Honest Man. Mobutu was able to bring a measure of stability to Zaire, but he did so by modeling himself after strongmen like Chairman Mao, ruling through a cult of personality.
Zaire is a huge country. There are so many different indigenous groups, tribal groups, that it's extremely difficult to try to control the country. Although Mobutu did so by playing one side off the other, and he managed to control things. It started to fall apart in the early 90s.
The 1991 military uprising wasn't the only thing that was unnerving the country when James arrived. There was also a health crisis going on, ravaging the continent and, indeed, wiping out entire communities all over the world.
That was just at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and nobody really understood what was happening. As I remember it, it was called SIDA in French. I remember most vividly that quite often people would take red paint and put the letters SIDA on the walls of their homes or the gate to their homes to signify that inside was somebody suffering from AIDS. Not only did it scare the hell out of everybody, it kept the burglars away because they didn't want to go into a house that had AIDS. You were constantly reminded of it.
Fortunately, despite the crises unfolding around him, the situation in Zaire wouldn't be entirely unfamiliar to James.
When I went through a course in my Special Forces training, what was called Operations and Intelligence course, to train the senior members of the teams, we had to write a country study on, they would throw out names and you would be assigned a country. By chance, the country I got to write my area study on about 6 years previously was the Congo, or the Republic of Zaire. So I already knew quite a bit, and I learned as much as I could before I got there, reading up on all the traffic and finding out what was going on.
James had learned about not just the politics and geography of Zaire, but about his future colleagues as well.
You had to learn all the people in the embassy, know who they were. We had photographs back in the States of all the people that were remaining in the embassy. Pictures had been sent out by our people.
But as a military man, James would be operating alone.
We had a two-man team go into the country to provide military assistance, communications capabilities, things that the embassy might need if the local infrastructure fell apart, which it did. And then I went in as a single guy. I replaced the two guys that were there, and I like to think that it was sort of like the Texas Ranger thing, you know, where the one guy shows up for the riot, and the locals are going, "Why is there only one of you?" And he goes, "Well, there's only one riot."
In March of 1992, James landed in Brazzaville, the capital of what is known today as the Republic of Congo. He would then take a ferry across the Congo River to Kinshasa, the site of the riots, a massive metropolis, and the capital of today's Democratic Republic of Congo.
When I landed at the Brazzaville airport, I think about 4 of us got off the airplane, and I remember walking into the baggage hall, and suddenly I was the only guy in the baggage hall, except for this one Congolese soldier who appeared to me about the size of Shaquille O'Neal. He was about 6'9", probably weighed about 350 pounds, and was carrying a machine gun with belts of ammunition all over him. So, not your usual airport security kind of people, but, and from there, you know, you're driving through the city down to the ferry and watching your bags because you've got people helping to put the bags onto the ferry, and then you've got other people that pick up the bags and head off into the city and steal everything you own. And I said to myself, this is going to be a really interesting time.
This sense of unease got its hooks into James, and it didn't let up. It just became part of everyday life.
I felt like I had to be on my guard most all the time, except when I was inside the embassy, and even then you kind of have this feeling that something is out there that could fall apart at any time.
For the most part, James says, Westerners in Kinshasa weren't targeted for killing, but their homes were often broken into, and they were targeted for robberies, so it was dangerous for Americans to be on the street.
When you're moving, you're always having awareness about you, trying not to go the wrong direction, trying to make sure you knew where you were all the time and who was around you. Probably the most dangerous thing you could do was travel alone. But unfortunately, because I was alone, I didn't have a whole lot of choice in the matter.
Quite a frame of mind to be in when you're starting a new job. But nevertheless, James got to work.
The American embassy declared an emergency, of course, but it also asked for what was known as, or still known as, a non-combatant evacuation. So all the Americans that were in country were given the option to leave. The embassy at the time was one of the largest in Africa. It was a regional embassy that covered a number of the local countries. The embassy, in about a week, went from 700 people to 35 who were gotten out of the country any way possible. The airport closed down, of course, so the major way to get people out was to take them across the Congo River to Brazzaville, which, of course, was another country, and then they could escape from there. So that's pretty much what I came in the middle of.
Unfortunately, not all of James's colleagues helped to assuage his sense of unease.
There were 2 security officers within the embassy, one of whom was, how can I say this, useless. He knew where the embassy was, he knew where his home was, and he knew where the recreation center, which were all grouped within about a mile circular area of the city. So that's pretty much all he knew.
That's a problem. If you're a security officer at an embassy in a country in turmoil, should anything go wrong, you'll need to have a good lay of the land.
But he had this very interesting assistant security officer. His name was Tom, and he was like a throwback. He had the best handlebar mustache I ever saw. He refused to carry an automatic pistol, which was the issue weapon for the diplomatic security service, which he was a member of. He carried a revolver, a wheel gun, because he thought it looked cool. He also refused to use the very early computers that were in the embassy. He used a typewriter to do everything. So he was, I don't know, I think he thought he was Wyatt Earp or something. So this was the guy I got to work with.
Like James, Tom was in his 30s. Importantly, this 1990s Wyatt Earp was blessedly more informed than their co-worker when it came to the who's and where's of Americans in Kinshasa.
My day-to-day was pretty much, I would watch what the security officers were doing, and their responsibility, of course, was to keep the embassy secure. We had a Marine detachment, I think, of about 11, and their only job was to secure the embassy and secure the classified information. My job was to find out as much as possible about the city and how I could get people out if things went even further downhill. I would do a reconnaissance of roads and routes to the airport, the best way to get down to the ferry, make sure I knew where each of the Americans lived so that if they were somehow stuck in their house, that we could go out and get them, find them, and bring them either into the embassy or to the airport.
In other words, James's job involved a lot of planning and contingency planning.
I also looked for places that I could put down helicopters or aircraft if we could not use the airfield. So I was doing surveys of landing zones and airfields, learning how to get across the Congo River in a 24-foot Boston whaler and not getting stuck on the sandbars, which seemed to change position every day.
2 miles downriver, rapids posed a deadly threat to those who weren't careful.
We didn't go water skiing because there was what was called the cataracts. And if you went into the cataracts, you would probably never come out. So it was that kind of operation.
But remember, the international airport had been shut down. That meant James had to spend a lot of time on the water, especially helping Americans with medical issues who needed to get out of the area for treatment.
We would use that boat, and we had a secure dock next to the ambassador's house. Get them from the docks, get them across the river so that the American embassy in Brazzaville could pick up these people and get them out of country or get them to medical help. All the hospitals had been basically ransacked.
And then there were the evacuations that happened, shall we say, off the books.
Jane Goodall had an office in Kinshasa, and they were always rescuing chimpanzees that had been brought in to the city to be sold to the Westerners as pets. And one of those chimpanzees that was on the market, someone from the embassy purchased with the idea of rescuing. Tried to give it to the Jane Goodall Foundation in Kinshasa, but they had no capacity to take it. They were up to their ears, I guess, in orphan chimps. So the plot was hatched to exfiltrate the chimpanzee from Kinshasa to Brazzaville to get it to the zoo over there. So the chimpanzee was put into a diplomatic cargo bag, given the proper paperwork and seals, and was put onto the ferry and exfiltrated out of the country without a passport and turned over to the Brazzaville Zoo. It was all quite a hush-hush classified operation, obviously. I don't think it was ever reported to Washington.
Despite the tension in his environment and the stress of his job, James thrived on the adrenaline and in the excitement. Maybe that's how, despite not being able to move about the city with ease, he somehow managed to have a dating life.
I mentioned to you that my predecessor team had sent out photographs of everybody in the embassy. One of the photographs was of this woman who was the consul general of the embassy. In other words, she was the woman who was responsible for basically ensuring the well-being of all the Americans to know where they are and what they're doing. She's also responsible for passports and issuing visas and things like that. I saw her picture and I said, well, this is not that I'm driven solely by looks, but I said, this looks like a person that I would like to meet.
Conveniently for James, of course, his job required him to meet everyone at the embassy, including the attractive consul general.
Despite the fact that I was a military person and she wasn't really keen on military people, she said, assented to me asking her out on a couple of dates. So we went out at night. Some of these restaurants that were close into the center of the city and were pretty secure. And one of the restaurants was a place called, I remember, La Ciboulette, or the Small Onion.
The consul general had served in Paris and knew a thing or two about eating well, James says.
And the Belgians, especially the French Belgians, are very good at food.
But enough whining and dining. James may have managed to find a girlfriend, but he couldn't lose sight of his primary role in Zaire. In the midst of all the robbings and burglaries, even Americans in good health needed his assistance. Travel, even across short distances, could be treacherous.
People were getting ambushed. People were still trying to move at night. And so we would go out at night and try to find which routes were the most secure to move on. People would sometimes run into a checkpoint and think that they could run the checkpoint and escape these soldiers who might be asking for a transit fee, we'll call, a bribe, essentially. And silly people that tried to run those checkpoints would often find out that just beyond that checkpoint was a second checkpoint. And they did not stop and ask for the bribe. They would shoot the people that were trying to escape through the checkpoint. So we were trying to find out where all those were and make sure people understood what they could and what they could not do.
Of course, it's not like James himself was immune to danger. In order to assist these Americans, he first had to look after himself.
I tried to figure out ways I could do things that would not put myself in jeopardy from these lone actors or soldiers who were not really well controlled. Too much alcohol or too much ganja, and they were a force to be reckoned with at any time.
One evening, James and a handful of his colleagues went for dinner at a local Belgian-owned restaurant and encountered one such force to be reckoned with.
I think there was about 6 of us, including a couple more security officers that had come in from the States to assess the situation. So I think there were 6 of us, and 4 of us were armed with pistols. And a soldier walked in, obviously inebriated, carrying a AK-47, as I remember. So he had this nice machine gun, and 2 of our security officers from the Washington Bureau went under the table. My friend Tom pulled out his wheel gun and put it onto the table, and I just kind of backed up into a corner and had my rucksack sitting in my lap where my own pistol was in, and we waited. And the guy walked around the lower part of the restaurant and asked for money, and came up to our table and kind of looked at us for a second, and then just saw Tom's gun there, and his hand was on the gun. The guy was not at all ready with his weapon, and he just sort of looked at the table for a second and turned around and walked out of the restaurant.
If that sounds stressful to you, just imagine that sort of anxiety being a part of your everyday life.
That kind of thing was sort of a daily occurrence in one way or another.
Even in his downtime, there was no real relaxing. You never knew what trouble you might encounter, or who you would meet that could change things in an instant.
The embassy was on a fairly large street. If you can imagine old colonial Belgian buildings and big trees with overhanging branches, and directly across the intersection that the American embassy sat on was a tiny little bar that was called the Safari Bar. And it was, I believe, by all sides assumed to be a safe haven because all kinds of people would go in there. So it became our home away from home, our headquarters, where we would go and talk about things over the day.
James called the Safari Bar their ops center.
The owner was a Belgian, and his wife was a Congolese woman who was the better business person of the two. And he knew how to serve the beer, which was all the local beer. And she knew that they also had to serve food to keep people happy. So she mastered the art of the American hamburger. And of course, they knew how to make French fries, pommes frites, being from Belgian background. So it was the best place in town to get a hamburger. And that's where we would go discuss the day's events and what we were going to do the next days.
Zaire may have had its challenges, but at least James was well fed. As he mentioned, Safari Bar attracted a diverse mix of clientele. Among its patrons was an American man in his 60s who wound up becoming a friend.
He was basically a bush pilot, but he was a bush pilot with a cargo plane, a DC-6, as I remember. An old prop-driven cargo plane, which was quite reliable. His job was, he said, to fly supplies back and forth to the mines in Congo.
Having a friend with a plane could come with significant perks if you're a guy like James. At the time, Congo wasn't the only Central African nation in the midst of upheaval.
Rwanda was just beginning to generate its own problems. In 1992, there was basically a break. The government, which was controlled by the Hutu, decided that they wanted to expel and disadvantage the minority Tutsi. So many of the Tutsi who were in the military went across the border to set up in a safe haven, which was Uganda. And 1992, they had an incursion back into the country. They were going to attempt to take over the government. It did not go well.
In Rwanda, heightened tensions between the Hutus and the Tutsis led to a rise in kidnappings and violence by extremists. Knowing that things could quickly go from bad to worse, the American embassy was planning a non-combatant evacuation in the capital, Kigali, just like the one that had taken place in Zaire.
My folks called me up and said, do you have any assets that can go into Rwanda and pick up the Americans?
In fact, James did know someone. His friend with the cargo plane from the safari bar. The one who was flying supplies to the mines in Congo. Or, at least, that's what he said he was doing.
What he was really doing was moving diamonds and quite often weapons. But, I wasn't going to comment on his proclivities because I wanted to use his airplane. And I asked him, I said, can you fly to Rwanda? And he said, well, if you can pay for the fuel, yeah. So I made a contract with him, and he was going to do our evacuation for, I think, the princely sum of $10,000 at least one way, to fly from Kinshasa to Kigali to pick up Americans and fly out. Luckily, we did not have to take him up on that offer.
The Hutus and the Tutsis reached an agreement that temporarily kept tensions at bay.
And they drew up a treaty which allowed things to continue as they were, basically, for the next about 2 years until the genocide happened.
As the months passed, the atmosphere in Congo began to change. James credits that shift in part to the arrival of Hank Cohen, who was then the Assistant US Secretary of State for African Affairs. Cohen, who is now in his 90s, has been passionate about US-African relationships for over half a century, having first served in Kinshasa as the US Chief of Mission in 1968.
A guy that, instead of writing a one-page report to send back to Washington, would sit down and type out 25 pages that would probably be better served as a book than anything else.
Mobutu extended an invitation to Cohen to come for dinner on his boat.
Mobutu was not in his palace in the city because basically it wasn't safe for him. So we had to mount a convoy to go through bad guy territory out to see Mobutu. I think we were 4 or 5 suburban kind of vehicles, and of course our senior security officer stayed in the embassy because it was safe there. He had to make sure that the embassy stayed safe, I'm sure. And it was Tom and me and not the Marines, but we had a sort of a contract security service that were ex-Congolese military. The ambassador actually did not go with us, but that nice consul lady that I was speaking of, she was with us because of her French ability. And a number of our Congolese security guys drove from the embassy out to where his yacht was moored on the Congo River. And here I'm picking imagery from movies again. It was sort of a combination of Africa Queen and Heart of Darkness.
The road to Mobutu's yacht was uncharacteristically smooth, James says. The kleptocrat president looked after his property with care.
But we're hanging out the windows with submachine guns watching for ambushes, and we pull up to this dock area, and this beautiful 110-foot old wooden yacht, straight out of the 50s probably, is moored on the river. And Hank and his translator, the consul, actually go in, and I briefly see Mobutu, but that was it.
Hank Cohen and his French translator, the consul general, entered the yacht to see Mobutu. James and his fellow security men stood on the dock and waited, watching the crocodiles in the river below them. Inside the yacht, Mobutu, making an effort to impress the ambassador, served his signature drink, pink champagne.
He didn't serve it himself. His servants, who were immaculately dressed, as was the crew of the boat, in white coats, of course, black trousers. The crew were outfitted in blue and white T-shirts with the French-style pork pie navy hat. Everything was European in orientation. I think he probably would have preferred to have been Emperor of France, but he couldn't quite make it. It was about a 2-hour meeting, and then we went back to the city, and I think we went across the street to the Safari Bar to celebrate still being living.
6 months after James assumed his post in Zaire, it seemed things were shifting. The environment appeared to require fewer security measures.
About August, things started to settle down. The troops returned to their barracks. The roadblocks and checkpoints disappeared. The police, the gendarmerie actually came back out onto the streets. The paratroopers returned to their barracks and were getting paid, so they were happy. The beer was still being produced, so everybody else was happy. And Kinshasa Airport was actually operating again.
Once the airport was back in operation, James was forced to say a difficult goodbye. The consul general he dated throughout his posting was returning to Washington.
Basically, it was like one of these scenes out of Casablanca, because I remember we went out to the airport and I was saying goodbye to her, and she climbed into the airplane to fly off to another airfield out of the country, and it was an old DC-3, World War II era cargo plane, or passenger plane by this time. It was like being in Casablanca when they crank up the engines and the smoke's rolling out of them, and I see her face in the window, and I'm waving at her, and I don't know if I'm going to see her again or not.
And then she was gone. After that, for James and for Zaire, things weren't so much like a Hollywood movie. They were, to the contrary, relatively normal.
And, some people attribute it to the typical leadership style of Mobutu, keeping people off balance and then coming back in and changing things all over again. But about the October timeframe, I was pretty convinced that things were going to stay reasonably normal for a while.
7 months after he'd arrived, that was that.
Maybe it's being hooked to adrenaline or not, but I was always looking for a new and interesting place to go. So I was actually kind of disappointed when I did have to leave in October.
From there, James had a brief stint working in Washington, and he reunited with the consul general.
We kept up our relationship there. Our relationship was really cemented, though, when I was wounded in Somalia and ended up at Walter Reed Hospital there in Washington, and she started showing up almost every day because she said, I feel sorry for you because nobody else is coming up and visiting. So that was kind of true. I didn't have that many close friends, but she obviously became my closest and bestest friend, so we got married in 1996.
A happy ending for these two civil servants. But for Zaire, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, this story is more complicated, particularly in the country's east.
The Congo, it is still very much a basket case. It's got so much potential, but it still has a governance problem. I don't see them fully exploiting that potential anytime soon.
Over the past 3 decades, over 6 million people have been displaced by conflict in the DRC, and nearly as many have been killed. Since James left the country, it has been through 2 civil wars, and it remains embroiled in an ongoing dispute. The conflict is the deadliest since the Second World War. The DRC also has to contend with continuing interest in and exploitation of its natural resources, and that interest has continued to incite competition across the global stage.
The Chinese want in, of course. The Russians, not so much, because they just don't have the power to do it. But the Chinese are definitely in competition with us. Southern Congo, along the border with Zambia and Botswana, that area is rich in other ores, especially copper, and that's a huge area of competition.
The minerals that the world's global superpowers are vying for dominance over are widely used in items like batteries and consumer electronics. But countries that mine for those metals, like the US and China, can end up inadvertently funding deadly rebel groups and prolonging the crisis in the DRC. What's more, resource mining is sometimes done by children, or under conditions sometimes referred to as modern-day slavery. James points to the Inga Dam, a proposed series of 7 hydroelectric power stations along the Congo River, as a project with the potential to ameliorate the situation in the region. It could both attract more foreign investment and improve quality of life for citizens of the DRC, only about 20% of whom have access to electricity. It could even potentially benefit the broader continent, he says.
If that could ever be put online, they could produce enough hydroelectric power for probably 2/3 of the continent of Africa.
But it could possibly exacerbate the DRC's existing problems as well. In any case, James says, it's a project that's unlikely to see the light of day anytime soon.
They don't have the strong government or the resources and infrastructure to do it. It's just been neglected for so long. And no American company wants to risk going in there.
Today, James is at work on several writing projects inspired by the places he worked and the stories he encountered there. Pick up one of his novels, and you may find yourself transported to some familiar places. Drinks at the safari bar, perhaps?
My entire military career was oriented about going to interesting places and doing things. So I was in my element, so to speak, being able to be in a strange place, a foreign country, and doing these kind of operations was just day to day. I'm living the life of Riley, so to speak.
James's latest novel, Dead Hand, is available now. I'm Rhiannon Needs. Join us next week for another encounter with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?
They had basically one security officer for every 180 members of the populace. And then they had unofficial contacts, which were informants. And it is estimated that of the East German population, 1 in 3 persons was an informant. And that could be inside families, offices, whatever. In 1989, when they captured the files within the headquarters, there was over 100 kilometers worth of files stored in the headquarters.
True Spies, The Debrief, from Spyscape Studios. Search for True Spies wherever you get your podcasts.